You're not a woodworker until you've got a box of scrap wood. Or maybe an entire wall of scrap wood. Now, certainly larger scraps are always gonna have a home in the wood shop for, furniture projects that you may run into down the road. But what about the small stuff that really starts to build up and turn into just a messy pile like I've got here? Now, I do a whole lot of joinery demonstrations in the hand tool school and for a lot of woodworking guilds around the country, so I may hang on to a lot more stuff than the average woodworker, but I mean, really, some of this stuff just gets out of control. And my little cardboard box that I started to fill it with, that starts to overflow and things just pile up, and it just turns into a mess that can be difficult to find anything in anymore. So I do try to cull the herd, if you will, just a little bit so this pile of scraps doesn't get out of control. The funny thing is, it's the really small, seemingly pointless scraps that end up finding the most use for. That's what I want to talk about today, purposeful use of your useless scraps. So I think the most obvious and maybe even most useful solution is things like squares. A little block of red oak and a block of teak and a couple pieces of holly formed into pegs has made this square that I use in just about every project in my shop. I've got another square here, I've got a miter square I've used, I've got some panel gauges, I've got a larger layout square, all really, really effective uses. Moreover, you can get even more complex, and I've used small pieces of stock to create a stair saw or a turning saw. It can be some really useful tools and jigs and measuring aids. Pinch sticks like I have here, used for capturing interior dimensions of projects, cabinets, things like that. All really great use. And look at this tiny piece of scrap. Now this is a piece of teak. It made sense to hang on to a valuable lumber like this, but it's turned into an incredibly valuable shop tool at the same time. Tools and jigs are kind of obvious, so let's talk about some obscure stuff. How many projects you've worked on where you end up a short little in-cut piece like this? I've got a 6-inch board and about a 3-inch offcut on the end of it. What the heck am I gonna do with this? Well, you could take a small piece like this and cut a rabbet on one end of it. So you end up with a board that has this little rabbet cut at the end, cross-cut that into individual pieces, take those individual pieces, drill some holes in them, put some screws in those, and you now have hardwood buttons that can screw to the underside of a tabletop. This rides in a groove in your apron, and you've got an expansion and contraction solution for your average table. Here's another one that may be a bit obvious. Say you're doing a lot of work with some screws and metal fasteners, and you're gonna need plugs to fill up those holes. Well, get yourself a plug cutter, grab the stock that matches whatever the project you're working on, you'll get perfectly matched plugs. Here's another common one. I end up with this long strip that's an offcut as I was dimensioning a board to something slightly narrower. And I end up with this, and you think, oh, there's a whole bunch of pin blanks there, but this is straight grain white oak. And I tell you, I've turned some pins from straight grain lumber. It's got some of its appeal, but when you get into a small thing like a pin blank, straight grain lumber can be pretty boring. This is not really something I want to use for that. But the properties, the structural properties of straight grain material, take this long strip, cross-cut it into smaller pieces, drive it through a dowel plate, and you've got pegs galore, folks. The original wood nail. Pegs, pegs, pegs. And I have a little, Tupperware coffee container thing here that I keep all kinds of riven pegs in. I also put some desiccate in here so they get super, super dry, and they make drawbore pegs or just plain old regular old pegs. And all you need really is a blank of wood like this big or this big. This seemingly useless but beautiful straight grain stock becomes an incredible structural joinery tool. Say maybe that offcut isn't structural. Maybe it's cheap big box store pine like I've got here. You can still find a use for it. I put some packing tape on this, and these are incredibly useful glue cauls. I can use this, put this over a panel, clamp it together to help keep the thing flat, and the tape prevents the whole thing from sticking to it. I've also used this for gluing together dovetail cases. The soft nature of the pine flexes and compresses around the hardwood pins, and it makes excellent clamping pressure for a dovetail joint. This holly, well, I actually cut little pieces off of this, and you might remember the square I showed you guys earlier, it has holly pegs. But one of the other things that comes up a lot for a species, you know, bright white species like holly, is I could actually plane this down a little bit thinner and use like a knife edge marking tool to cut it into thinner strips and end up with material that I'm ready to use for like stringing inlay. And I've got a lot of this stuff that's already been prepped and I've just rubber banded it together and I set it aside. It has time to dry, so it's not going to shrink a whole bunch. So when I put it into the inlay groove, it's not going to get loose on me as it shrinks a bunch. Holly, this seemingly tiny little useless scrap, becomes incredibly valuable if you're doing like federal style inlay. I just mentioned the structural nature of straight grain woods. Well, here's another straight-ish grain wood, and I can go ahead and split out a piece that maybe is, I don't know, about 3/4 of an inch, and I can grab a chisel over here at a bench hook and I can begin to taper it down and quickly start to form a wedge. Now, obviously this is way too long, but I could form a wedge on one end, form a wedge on the other one, cross cut them off, and you very quickly have wedge material for wedging leg blanks, wedging tenons, things like that. And this happens to be from African utility, which could be kind of a cool contrast as well. But again, this was a tiny little piece. This actually was a tenon cheek, split off, very quickly formed into shape. You know, while we're talking about smaller scrap, the bench hooks I'm working on, this was made from small offcuts of ash, actually from my own workbench. So yet another infinitely usable project here in the shop. While we're talking about really useful bench appliances, you guys might remember way long ago, I made these little things I call joiner saddles that fit right into my dogs. And I can set a board on it and I can plane into octagon shapes, or any kind of edge planing that I need. There's an octagon leg. In fact, I've got a video where I made that octagon leg and I use these joiner saddles, and you can see the scrap needed. This was just some leftover Douglas fir, cut a hole in it, and I was off to the races. Here's another one I use a lot when I've got a thin piece like this. This is just over 1/8 of an inch thick, and you think, first of all, it's made out of poplar. What the heck am I gonna do with it? But this makes an outstanding batten. You guys probably know I do all of my planing up against a planing stop. So I can slide it up there, but if I've got to do any work that's anywhere but against that direction of force, this little guy comes in incredibly handy. Skinny bit of stock here and a hold fast, whack those in place, and I've got the ability to sandwich this board into an inside corner. I can plane across it diagonally, or I could do something like grab a plow plane, set the fence, have the fence running off the edge, and work right up against this batten. I could take something as simple as a single dog, pull it up, run the board against it and against the batten, and I can work this way, or I can flip the board around and work that way very quickly, just using something simple like this batten. For that matter, little pieces. This is 1/8 inch thick cherry, left over from a box project from a long time ago, but these little pieces can be really beneficial to drop like on one of my bench hooks, and I can use the same hold fast or whatever to secure that onto the bench hook and have the exact same operation I'm showing here on the workbench on a smaller scale set right down on my paring hook, a batten to work against and a stop to work against with this little bit of useless scrap. And you know, while I've got my plow plane in my hand, another use for useless scrap, plain setup blocks. This is a setup block that I use for creating grooves in drawer sides for the drawer bottom. I execute those grooves with my plow plane. So I've got, really, this is actually a drawer slip that's cut off. I can take this and very easily drop the blade into the groove that I've already formed, loosen up my fence, slide the fence into place, tighten up the fence, and I can set my depth stop to the depth of that groove. And this plane is now set to exactly duplicate the groove that I have in here. And again, that's the groove that I use for just about every drawer I make, a repetitive action constantly getting used. You can create a little bit of scrap with a rabbet in it. And you may think, what do I need that for? Well, this rabbet, say you do a lot of casework and you're doing a lot of dado and rabbet type joinery. This could be the exact dimension of a rabbet that you use to join the case side to the case top. Or maybe you do a lot of work in plywood and that dimension is not an even 3/4. It's 23/32 or something like that. And you want this repeatable way to set up something like your Philister plane or any rabbet plane. I can do the same thing where I drop it in place. And especially in something like a wooden Philister plane like this, it can sometimes require 3 hands because I've got 2 screws here to tighten up. By using this setup block, I can hold it in place and it acts as my 3rd hand to come in, tighten up the fence, and while I'm at it, I can set the depth stop at the same time. Now this plane is set up to create that rabbet. If this rabbet, this just happens to be a piece of scrap, if this rabbet was something that I did time and time again, I'd use a Sharpie marker and label it as casework rabbet. And I could always set my Philister plane from here on out very quickly, but more importantly, repeatedly from joint to joint to joint. It's not so much about the speed, but the repeatability. I've got a bunch of longer strips, thin strips that I stick over here on my planer. These guys, they're stickers. Anytime I resaw a board, I'm going to put stickers into it in between those panels to allow a little bit of airflow and allow the board to come into equilibrium moisture content with my shop. These stickers are incredibly useful. These just happen to be cheap pine. I've had them around for a while. Every time I end up with a piece of scrap kind of like this, I take it, throw it in that spot on my planer, and I always have plenty of stickers for that. Moreover, similar type application where you may have even thinner or even skinnier pieces, I have the same thing with rubber band on it, and these, the unglamorous job of stirring finish. You always got to stir up that finish, especially if it's anything other than a high gloss finish. There's going to be sediment in there. You got to stir that up or your finish is going to look crappy. And you know, sometimes the scrap itself is quite valuable. And even though you may have a tiny little bit, like this little bit of Zerakote, you want to hang on to it because who knows if you're going to end up with a piece like that again. And that's when you end up with door pulls. The Macassar ebony that I used for all the pulls on my tool cabinet, all the drawers, you know, it's ebony. You want to use every last inch of it. Or maybe even something as small as a shaker peg. A little piece of walnut. How many times do you find walnut shaker pegs? They're usually cherry or something like that. I wanted walnut, so I made some walnut shaker pegs out of a tiny little pin blank size piece of walnut. Maybe you need to make an arts and crafts drawer pull, and you can take a little tiny bit of stock and make a whole bunch of identical drawer pulls out of it. Or you want something for a decorative box, and it's a good use of maybe some cherry and some purple heart or whatever random species you have floating around. The tiny little bits of stock, no matter how figured, how crazy the grain is, or how weird the color is, can make a perfect focal point on something small like a box. The other thing is anytime I'm sticking molding, you do it obviously that you end up with a little bit left over. So when you miter the molding, you've got this little piece left over. Well, that may be useless scrap. What am I going to do with this if the molding is already done? Well, if I wanted to create this molding again, I have the absolute perfect tool now to determine which hollows and which rounds I want to use to stick that molding again. I can literally set my planes right into it and remember, oh, okay, I used a number 8 to form that cove in the middle. And I used a number 4 to form that cove in the side. And I used my snipe's bill to form this little bead. Here's an astragal chair rail molding that I've used a number of times. And I can, again, use it to reverse engineer and remember exactly how I created that molding. But now it's more of a pattern or a template to recreate a molding. And you know, while we're talking about it, sometimes it's just for practice. You got a hunk of poplar. I wanted to learn how to carve a ball and claw foot. This was, I think, my second attempt, but great use of something like poplar. Also, poplar's kind of stringy. If you can carve in poplar, you certainly can carve in mahogany pretty easily. Depending on the work that you do, you may have, here's a demonstration I did on half-blind dovetails and a piece of basswood. Well, I got into making shaker boxes recently, and I needed something nice and uniform basswood's perfect for that. So I made a small number 0 shaker box template, and I'm gonna make a 00 and a 000 box at the same time. And I've already created the templates for that I can cut out of this, and this useless piece of stock now becomes a bending form for a shaker box. Don't even get me started on scrap veneer. Since I got into Marquetry, I am hoarding veneer like crazy. Fortunately, veneer takes up very little room. I've got a Rubbermaid tub that lives next door in my laundry room that's just filled with tiny, tiny little pieces of exotic veneers that make great Marquetry. God, I think I need a support group for my Marquetry problem. I have a storage container that slides under my workbench here that is absolutely filled with large sheets of veneer. But hey, like I said, you can hoard veneer scrap all day long because it takes up very little space. But unfortunately, the point of this video is you never know how useful that useless scrap could be. And this thinking can get you into trouble very quickly. You'll be coming out the ears with useful scrap that I'm going to save it for some reason sometime far off in the future. So you do need to put some guidelines, some rules in place. So I have my scrap box. It's a pretty small box, as you can see, but it holds a heck of a lot of scraps. And they have a lot of the purpose that I talked about before. It's pretty small, and when this thing gets full, I stop worrying about saving scrap. I just get rid of it. I burn it. Because remember, s'mores are just as important as fine drawer pulls and things like that. Sometimes you just gotta burn the stuff. Until you fill this box, you can be a little bit more liberal about the stuff you keep, but you do need to think about some things. Like I said earlier, straight grain stock is great for structural purposes like pegs, but kind of boring in small pieces like drawer pulls. So if you got a small piece of straight grain stock and you can't make it into a peg, get rid of it. It's not really something you need to hang on to. But remember, the figured stuff or knotty, that's terrible for structural purposes. Try taking a highly figured piece of something and pairing it into a wedge like I was showing earlier. It's an absolute nightmare. Can be a real problem there. So save your figured stuff for ornamental purposes and not for the structural things. And using those rules in mind, you start to realize this is not worth saving. I should go make s'mores with this, or this should go in the scrap box. And I urge you, don't make it a scrap box. Make it a scrap box, a little box, and it will help you keep that habit under control. Ultimately, I have my scrap box on the other side of the shop from where I normally work. And if the time it takes me to walk from my workbench over to the corner of my shop where the scrap box is, I can't think of a reason for it, I tend to throw it out. Don't spend a whole bunch of time obsessing over it, or you will end up with scrap absolutely everywhere. So I hope this helps you kind of figure out some of the uses for that purposeless stock. And if I've missed something, or if you have some great reasons, let me know in the comments below. And thanks for watching, everybody.